Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about the importance of making sure you're doing two different exercises for any given muscle when you are trying to achieve maximum hypertrophy. And this kind of flies in the face of minimalist type training, because oftentimes we'll have minimalist training that will tell us, well, you can do one big exercise and, with sufficient volume and workload, a muscle will grow, such as bench press for pecs, right? Squats for your quads. And there is truth to that. Yes, they will grow. And I want to be very clear on that. People who are like, well, you have to do a certain amount of work. The amount of work you have to do to stimulate some muscle growth is actually a lot lower than most people think it is. It really and truly is. I think particularly when you get into the big exercises because of the overlap involved. In other words, a person could come in and do 4, 5, 6 exercises per week, as long as the volume is reasonable on them and there's progression there. They will gain. They will still gain. It's just that it may be much slower growth than they want, but it will happen, particularly with the overlap. Things like squats and deadlifts overlap a lot of muscles. People who do benching and overhead pressing, there is some muscle overlap. So there is truth to that, but the problem we do have, though, is that ultimately we know based upon the research that if the same amount of volume is done, split amongst at least 2 different exercises, and this doesn't necessarily apply to 3, 4, or 5. People want to come and do 5 different movements. Not what we're talking about. That's on the other crazy extreme. Like to say that doing 5 different exercises in a week for a muscle will cause more muscle growth is as ludicrous of an extreme as someone who's claiming, you can get away with just 1 exercise. That's just as ridiculous. There's no basis for it. But what we do know is that when at least 2 good exercises are done for a muscle over the same amount of volume, in the literature that's looked at it, it does seem to cause a little more muscle growth. In other words, let's say you're going to do 10 total sets a week for a muscle, right? And that's up near our optimal threshold. You're going to do 10 total sets, because we know 10 to 20 is pretty much the sweet spot for maximizing and optimizing hypertrophy. Again, literature is relatively consistent on that, even in advanced lifters. Again, provided that the stimulus is intense enough. And that's what we're coming down to. Are they actual quality sets to where you worked, right? Did you put in real work? 10 sets may put you near maximum growth. But what we know is that if you split it up over a couple of exercises, what happens? We get better muscle growth. It is slightly better. It doesn't happen every time, but it seems to happen in the majority of the cases. And that's what we're shooting for, right? We want to look at, say, if something works 80 or 90% of the time, that's a real good rule to follow. And it might have just been the individuals involved who didn't see the growth, right? It could have just been their workloads were too low, because it does seem to generally occur. And they don't have to be always dramatically different, but if they can be fairly different, yes, that helps. And so I'm showing in this video just stuff from a couple of weeks of training, a few random exercises that I did, and perfect examples. Look at what you see for posterior chain. I'm doing some deficit deadlifts, and I think I've got some glute ham raises in here. Okay, those two combined together, look at posterior chain, hamstring development, glutes, lower back. Okay. Those 2 movements are very, very different. One of them is purely a hip hinge, and the other has quite a bit of knee flexion involved, which works a different part of the hamstrings. They both work the glutes, the lower back. One of them is slightly better for the hamstrings, and one of them is slightly better for glutes and low back. All right, they combine together to do that. Of course, there is some quad and stuff work. All right, look at the squatting type movements. I'm doing really deep belt squats in this video. You'll see that in the background. And I started off with some speed boxes, right? Doing speed box squats. Now, these are very, very, very similar movements, but they are different enough that there is a slightly different training stimulus, particularly because one of them has a dead stop and a change in the stretch reflex, right? Breaks up the eccentric concentric chain, different loading, different strength curve because of the chains and the speed work, whereas in the other is, again, using a normal stretch reflex and a more flat strength curve. So a little bit different. That's enough to make a difference, 2 different exercises. You look at the chest stuff I'm doing in this workout. You saw some flat benching and you saw some incline benching. All right. Slightly different angles involved. And that's what we're looking for, because some muscles are not that complex. The pectoral is not particularly complex. It doesn't serve multiple different functions. It has a few different angles, and there can be bias in the fibers around that. But that's a really good combination because of that. Whereas with the hamstring has more than one function, right? It's a biarticulated muscle. It has functions that work at 2 different joints. So therefore, the pure hip hinge with the glute ham raise is a great combination. Chest is not as important. Just hitting 2 different angles is definitely enough to maximize chest growth. And I think, for those workouts, I did 3 sets of each following a training max. And if you do that twice a week, that's 12 total sets, 2 different exercises. All right, that is in our sweet spot. That's in our sweet spot. All right, what about back? In this clip, you'll see me doing some barbell rows that a lot of people call pen leg rows, but they're just barbell rows, and then some neutral grip weighted pull-ups. All right, that is 2 vastly different angles. It changes the ratios around a lot of how much lat, posterior delt, trapezius, everything is being used, rhomboid. Changes them. The pull-ups are obviously better for biceps. The rows are probably better for traps. Those are going to be significantly different between the 2. But then again, you also saw me doing some deficit deadlifts. That's also good for traps. So again, you start talking trapezius. We've got at least 3 different exercises in there that are really effectively working the traps, just at different ratios and angles. So again, a lot of variation in there. That is sufficient. What about triceps? Well, I did all that pressing. So if you look, what else did I do throughout the week there? Some tricep extensions, lying tricep extensions, to where you go behind the head, get a deeper stretch of the tricep, potentially, possibly more long head activation. So it tends to complement the benching very well. Whereas we know bench pressing actually seems to beat extensions for the lateral head of the tricep, but not necessarily things like the long head. This is going to be superior for the long head. Keeping in mind, the flat bench and the incline still work the entire tricep, just like this does, but different fibers and different heads are being worked at a slightly different ratio. So different muscle fibers are going to be utilized. All right, this combination is great for triceps because we're now working all the functions, keeping in mind the tricep, again, has functions at both ends of the joint. We're making sure that we're working both of those functions with these movements. All right, that is, again, how we combine exercises to get complete development. And we still want to push certain movements, sure. I mean, as you guys can tell, obviously, as a power lifter, I'm going to push squat, bench, and deadlift a lot. They're going to be high priorities, or at least close variations of them. But we need these other movements to fill in the gaps, to fill in the weak links, to maximize muscle growth. And by combining exercises together, that's the best way to do it. And again, you don't need to be extreme. You don't need like 5. 2, maybe 3 in some cases is usually going to be your sweet spot. But the 3rd is oftentimes questionable. At that point, we're just adding more volume usually. So, but if you're doing at least 2 that complement each other well, you're essentially ensuring enough variation, if you're pushing them hard enough with sufficient volume, that you should be seeing very, very solid, substantial muscle growth. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.